The right to protest was originally defined in the Bill of Rights, but has been changing and evolving to fit our modern world. The Bill of Rights gives us the right to protest, but it is the responsibility of the government and law enforcement to maintain peace and safety while also respecting the rights of the people to spread their ideas. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and movements like the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War protests, and more recently, Occupy Wall Street, have shaped these rights. This is Rights and Responsibilities, Protesting in a Modern World.
Civil rights movement was one of the most iconic eras of change in American history. The civil rights movement was based on the idea that African Americans and white people have the same rights. It was sparked by the murder of Emmett Till and, more importantly, the horrible trial that ensued. Its murders were left off and determined innocent by an all-white jury. This movement changed the course of American history forever. The movement was led by Martin Luther King Jr., who became one of the most historical figures of all time. He was an advocate, speaker, peaceful protester, and his ideas involved boycotting, sit-ins, marches, and his powerful speeches. His speeches became the voice of civil rights activists across the nation. His most famous speech was his I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream.
One main thing that was protested was segregation, which was the separation of white and blacks in public places. There were separate bathrooms, restaurants, and even water fountains. Blacks were forced to sit in the backs of buses, which sparked another famous civil rights activist, Rosa Parks. Her arrest led to the Montgomery bus boycott, when thousands of people refused to ride buses, causing the bus to lose money. Among the good, there was also bad, and hate organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, who terrorized anyone who tried to change the unfair system. The police did nothing when people were hurt or killed because many of them were members themselves. Overall, the protests and peaceful methods of change brought the racial equality we know today.
What do we want? Peace. What do we want? Now. What do we want? Freedom. And when do we want? Now. Peace now. Freedom now. Peace now. Freedom.
The Vietnam War was a civil war between the Communist North and the rebelling South. In an attempt to stop the spreading of communist ideas, the United States sent troops in to fight the North and to aid the South in their struggle to break free. Many problems arose when the Army used cruel methods of warfare, such as napalm, which was liquid fire that stuck to your skin. The war was long and without an end in sight. Many Americans were upset because so many people were dying and their money was being spent on the war. When the government started to draft young men, the balance was tipped and many people took to the streets. Many young people were outraged at the horror and the unfairness that was the drafts. The American youth were the main people who were upset at this, and protests took place all over the country. Colleges became hot spots for protesting against the war. Kent State University in particular made a big stand against the war. Kent State University's group that called themselves the World Historians Opposed to Racism and Exploration organized a mock funeral declaring that President Nixon's invasion of Cambodia murdered the Constitution. This was widely reported in the national press and would lead to a weekend of protest, riots, and in the end, death. One morning, protesters circled the headquarters for Reserve Officers Training Corps where students trained to be in the military. The Reserve Officers Training Corps was a major target for protesters. They burned the building, and when firemen arrived to put out the fire, they punctured the hoses and let the building burn to the ground. The National Guard was called in the next day. Protesting was banned, but that didn't stop the students from protesting the involvement of the government in the war, so tear gas was launched, and then they were beaten and bayoneted. Later that day, another protest was called and resulted in brutal violence. Tear gas was tried, but failed due to the wind, and the outnumbered National Guards retreated, reformed, and opened fire. 4 students were killed, and the shootings were ruled unnecessary. The responsibility of law enforcement to keep the people safe while allowing them to express their beliefs was unsuccessful. What the protesters did was illegal and going past their First Amendment rights, but it wasn't necessary for the National Guard to open fire on the protesters that weren't a threat. This became a rallying cry for other campuses in the United States, as well as protesters everywhere, because it was all over the news. With all of the pressure on Nixon and the government, they pulled the United States soldiers out of Vietnam, proving the protest successful. The right of the people to protest was used to pressure the government, resulting in the end of the war. The responsibility of law enforcement. was not done perfectly, but in the end, the desires of the people of the United States were met.
Occupy Wall Street. The Occupy Wall Street protests began in 2009 and became very popular in 2011. It started in New York City, but it spread across the nation. The rallying point of the Occupy Wall Street protests was Zuccotti Park. Protesters took over the park to protest. They protested big business and huge corporations. They believe that the government is corrupt and that the money runs the government. We went to Zuccotti Park during a protest and conducted some interviews. Alright, so live at an Occupy Wall Street protest and Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, we have an officer, Officer Feeney. He is going to answer some questions.
So, what were some of the tactics that the Occupy Wall Street protesters used last year?
Their main thing was this was their main camp over here, which they had several hundred people staying here around the clock. And when they would demonstrate, one of the main things that they would do is they would march in large groups and just branch off into 10 or 12 different groups. They would go to different locations, and they would try to block traffic. They would try to go out into the street and disrupt traffic around Wall Street. They would try to block entrances to buildings, to some of the main institutions in Wall Street. And that was the main tactics that they used. They just tried to use their numbers to disrupt the traffic and the goings-on around Wall Street. During the bigger protests, where there were several thousand people here, they would get a little bit more involved. There were some instances where they chained themselves across the roadways. When we were going to make arrests, the large groups, you couldn't see who was who. Would sometimes throw bottles and other debris at us. Those tactics were used also when we went in to clear the park. For the most part, most of the protests were fairly peaceful, disruptive in the sense of, disrupting traffic and people coming to and from work down here, but for the most part, not overly violent.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Have a good day.
Have you ever been in a protest where it got a little bit out of hand?
Of course, I've seen children.
Children?
Because these are children here.
Yeah.
Most of Occupy Wall Street are young men and women. Okay?
Get a job.
I look at as children. I've seen them beaten down with clubs by
Wow.
police. I've seen them bleed. I've seen them cry
Ow.
during the Occupy
Whoa.
Wall Street movement. A horrible, horrible thing. And we got to fight against that. We got to make sure that freedom is freedom and not some word that you would just throw out there.
Thank you so much for your time.
What's your name?
Saul Glist.
Saul, very nice to meet you.
I'm Woods Johnson.
Oh, very nice to meet you.
I'm Mason Brady.
Oh, very nice. Thank you very much for
I'm-
stopping by.
Well, thank you. Conclusion. How does this relate? The right to protest is a balance. It's a balance between the right of the people to protest and express their ideas, and the responsibility of law enforcement and government to keep people safe and to maintain peace and civility throughout the nation.
Produced by Mason William Brady, Saul Asher Glist, and Henry Woodward Johnson.